The corrosive, boiling acid rain stung Tyler Murray's skin through his shredded envirosuit as the Xanthian mega-predator's venomous jaws clamped down on his leg with the force of an industrial hydraulic press, dragging his flailing body through the sulfur-choked swamp. Tyler's lungs burned, each desperate gasp of scalding air feeling like molten lead pouring down his throat. The beast's pustule-covered hide oozed luminous ichor that ate through Tyler's reinforced vanadium weave armor like wet tissue paper. He blindly groped for his rifle's charging handle, the roars of the alien monster and the crunching of his own bones echoing in his ears. 3 days ago, 28-year-old exo-scout Tyler Murray, the lone human explorer assigned to survey the newly discovered planet Xantha, had stepped out of his landing pod and onto the soggy marshland that passed for solid ground on this hellish world, orbiting a dim, bloated red dwarf star. The weak red light filtering through the ubiquitous sulphurous haze had stung his eyes, and the humid, poison-thick air had left him retching even through his rebreather's military-grade filters. But orders were orders. The Terran Alliance needed data on Xantha's biosphere and indigenous Taktak aliens before establishing first contact or mining rights, so here Tyler was, slogging through this primordial ooze while lugging an arsenal of scientific instruments. His primary job was to document the native flora and fauna without being detected by the pre-spaceflight TACs, per Alliance First Contact protocols. Secondary objectives included mapping mineral deposits and identifying exploitable resources. All the details were loaded onto the heads-up display integrated into his helmet, each objective precisely broken down into actionable steps by the very best mission planning AI's taxpayer money could buy. The plan had seemed simple enough during the briefing, but they had left out the part about Xantha apparently wanting to kill him. Within an hour of landing, he had already been sprayed with acid by a putrid flower the size of a truck tire, almost swallowed whole by a bioluminescent pool of carnivorous quicksand, and had his boot nearly dissolved by the corrosive saliva drooling from the fanged petals of what he had mistaken for a patch of innocent ferns. Now, on just his 3rd day, a creature that looked like a cross between a grizzly bear and a giant leech was doing its level best to bite him in half, and he increasingly suspected its efforts would prove successful. Tyler had shot the damn thing 5 times with his plasma rifle, each blast powerful enough to vaporize an unarmored human torso, but it just wouldn't die. His odds of surviving long enough to complete the mission were dwindling by the second as this beast shredded him into bloody ribbons. He felt his grip on consciousness slipping, and his mind flashed to the dire urgency of his task. The Alliance diplomats needed this intel to peacefully secure resource rights and establish beneficial trade relations with the TACs before the aggressive Zox Empire moved in and conquered this sector. Without access to the critical rare earth elements and radioactives locked beneath Xantha's crust, the Alliance shipyards would grind to a halt and humanity would be defenseless against the oncoming Zox armada. At that moment, as he stared into this alien predator's gaping maw, Tyler realized his survival was inconsequential. Even if he died, he needed to complete this survey and get the data out to the fleet, else billions of human lives would be lost. Humanity itself hung in the balance, with only his shredded, bleeding arms to tip the scales. Summoning a final surge of desperate strength, he wrenched his rifle up and jammed the superheated barrel into the monster's putrid eye. With the monster finally dead, Tyler slumped against a gnarled tree trunk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His entire body ached, the creature's venomous bite sending waves of pain lancing up his shredded leg. But there was no time to rest. He had to dispose of the carcass and fast before any tuk-tuk stumbled upon the scene. Tyler limped over to the corpse, its putrid stench assaulting his nostrils even through the rebreather. He tried to drag it, but the damned thing had to weigh at least a ton. There was no way he could move it in one piece. Gritting his teeth, he drew his plasma rifle and dialed the power down to its lowest setting. The superheated barrel sizzled as he pressed it against the creature's neck and began to slice. The decapitation was messy work, the beast's leathery hide resisting the improvised plasma cutter. Luminous ichor sprayed across Tyler's visor, momentarily blinding him. Finally, with a sickening crunch, the head came free. Tyler quickly sealed it in a specimen containment cylinder. It would be a valuable data point for the xenobiologists back on Terra. He stuffed the gruesome parcel into his rucksack, then turned his attention to the rest of the body. A deep, bubbling tar pit lay a short distance away, its surface roiling with noxious gases. It would have to do. Summoning his last dregs of strength, Tyler heaved the carcass up onto his shoulders, his knees nearly buckling under the weight. Step by tortuous step, he hauled it to the edge of the pit and tipped it in with a wet slurp. Exhausted, Tyler scanned the twisted trees for a defensible spot to make camp, finally settling on one with branches that vaguely resembled a baobab, albeit with sickly grey bark. He clambered up into the foliage, his movements sluggish. From his pack, he withdrew a ration bar that had the consistency and flavour of chalk dust. He choked it down anyway, knowing he needed the calories. As the bloated red sun dipped below the horizon, Tyler set up his perimeter sensors, syncing them with his helmet display. The keening wails and distant howls of nocturnal predators filtered through the dense foliage, a hellish alien lullaby. Cradled in the tree's gnarled branches, Tyler finally let his eyes drift shut. A shrill alarm jerked him awake, his heart pounding against his ribs. He checked his display. Something had triggered the sensors. Tyler peered out into the murky pre-dawn light, barely able to make out a hunched simian silhouette standing motionless at the very edge of the sensor radius. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready to spring into action. But the figure didn't move. It seemed to be staring directly at him, though he couldn't be sure at this distance. Tyler hardly dared to breathe, counting the seconds as they stretched into minutes. Finally, the silhouette turned and shambled off, quickly vanishing into the misty undergrowth. Tyler let out a shaky breath, a chill running down his spine. According to the mission briefing, that had likely been a Tuk-Tuk scout. Had it seen him? He couldn't be sure. He waited until well after daybreak to descend from his perch, every rustle of leaves setting his nerves on edge. The ground around the tree was a morass of sludge and rotting vegetation, but a glint of orange caught his eye. He crouched down, finding a tuft of coarse coppery fur snagged on a thorny vine. A few paces away, he spotted a patch of damp soil with a bizarre footprint, 7 splayed toes tipped with hooked claws. Using his suit's integrated cameras, Tyler captured images of both the fur and the print. He uploaded them to the lander's computer core and ordered a full spectrum analysis. As the program ran, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into the back of his skull. He whirled around, pulse rifle at the ready, visually sweeping the dense foliage for any sign of movement, but he saw nothing. The sense of being watched, however, only intensified, sending a trickle of cold sweat down his back. The computer pinged, startling him. The results scrolled across his visor. Genetic analysis confirmed the fur sample was Tuk-Tuk in origin, but that wasn't what made Tyler's blood run cold. The soil sample contained distinct traces of the creature he had killed yesterday. Ichor skin cells, the works. A lead weight settled in the pit of Tyler's stomach as the implications sank in. The Tuk-Tuk had found the remains. They knew he was here. And if they traced it back to him... He didn't let himself finish that thought. Breaking camp with a renewed sense of urgency, he shouldered his pack and set off through the forest at a fast clip, following the coordinates to the next pre-programmed survey point. He could only pray he reached it before the Tuk-Tuk reached him. Tyler trudged through the tangled vines and spongy moss, each squelching step seeming to sap more strength from his battered body. The makeshift tourniquet on his mangled leg had finally stopped the bleeding, but every movement sent daggers of agony lancing up his thigh. Sweat stung his eyes and plastered his hair to his forehead beneath his helmet. He nearly stumbled straight into the clearing before he saw it, so focused was he on simply putting one foot in front of the other. He froze at the edge of the tree line, breath catching in his throat. In the center of the clearing stood a twisted mass of gnarled branches, lashed together with strips of sinew and leather to form a crude altar. Shards of yellowed bone and desiccated strips of leathery flesh hung from the interwoven boughs, clattering against each other in the fetid breeze. All around the macabre monument, The damp earth was pocked with dozens of clawed footprints of varying sizes. Tyler's heart began to race. The tuk-tuk had been here, and recently. A whole group of them, based on the sheer number of prints. His grip tightened on his rifle. He knew he should keep moving, put as much distance as possible between himself and this place. But his scientific curiosity got the better of him. This was the first concrete sign of tuk-tuk culture he'd encountered. Against his better judgment, he stepped into the clearing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he approached the altar. Up close he could see that the bones were intricately carved with swirling alien glyphs. The desiccated flesh, he realized with a shudder, was not from any creature he recognized. Fighting back a wave of nausea, he raised his suit's integrated camera and began to take scans from every angle, making sure to capture all the details. The anthropologists back home would have a field day with this. An ominous rumble drew his attention skyward. The perpetual haze had darkened to an angry, roiling grey while he'd been engrossed in his scans. A flash of sickly green lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening boom that seemed to shake the ground itself. Frowning, Tyler consulted the meteorological readout scrolling across his helmet's HUD. The atmospheric pressure was plummeting rapidly, and the concentration of exotic particles in the upper atmosphere was spiking to dangerous levels. Xantha's lack of a magnetosphere left it vulnerable to intense radiation storms, and it looked like he was about to be caught in a doozy. He needed to find shelter, and fast. He cast about, looking for anything that could shield him from the oncoming onslaught. There, at the far side of the clearing, a jagged crack in a hillside, partially obscured by a tumble of mossy boulders. It was deep enough to be a cave. Tyler hurried over, ducking his head as he squeezed through the narrow opening. The cave walls quickly opened up into a larger chamber, the beam of his headlamp swallowed by inky darkness. He ventured deeper, picking his way carefully over the uneven ground until he found a spot that curved away from the entrance, providing some measure of protection from the raging storm outside. With a grunt, he slid down the rough stone wall into a sitting position, favoring his injured leg. He fumbled a ration bar from his pack, tearing into the tasteless, chalky block with a grimace. Nothing to do now but wait it out. As he chewed mechanically, he became aware of an eerie quality to the howling and screeching of the winds outside. The contorted tunnels of the cave seemed to amplify and distort the sounds until they began to resemble tortured, agonized wails. Tyler felt a prickle of unease. Rationally, he knew it was just the acoustics of the cavern playing tricks on his mind, but in this alien darkness, it was hard to shake the feeling that the tortured sounds held some darker meaning, some malicious intent. He was snapped out of his morbid musings by a shrill beeping from his wrist scanner. His blood turned to ice water in his veins as he saw the readout. Multiple life signs detected, and they were converging on his position from deeper within the cave system. Adrenaline surging, he scrambled to his feet, bringing his rifle to bear on the yawning tunnel mouth. He could hear them now, a skittering, shambling horde growing louder by the second. His finger tightened on the trigger. They burst from the darkness like a nightmarish tide, a mass of twisted, misshapen bodies, wielding crude stone clubs and spears. Tyler's eyes widened in shock. These were no primitive savages. The leaders of the pack wore some kind of powered exoskeleton, crackling with eldritch energies. Alliance intelligence had been dead wrong. The tuk-tuk were far more advanced than they had believed. As the horde surged forward with uncanny coordination, Tyler saw their eyes, solid, depthless black, like staring into the void of space itself. Their mouths gaped open, splitting their faces in an X-shaped maw lined with needle-like teeth. They gibbered and shrieked in a language that sounded like nails on a chalkboard, utterly incomprehensible to Tyler's translator implant. With a blood-curdling cry that sounded like the death scream of a star, they charged as one. Tyler open-fired, the flashing plasma bolts searing smoking holes through their ranks. But they came on unperturbed, trampling the charred bodies of their comrades without hesitation, moving with a speed and surety that was decidedly unnatural. Tyler backpedaled furiously, pouring plasma fire into the mass. the ozone tang of ionized air filling his nostrils. But it wasn't enough. They were nearly on top of him now, an inexorable tide of snapping jaws and grasping claws. He could see the feral hunger in those depthless eyes, could feel their alien bloodlust like a palpable force. In a flash of sickening clarity, Tyler realized this was no warband. It was a hunting party, and he was the prey. Tyler yanked a concussion grenade from his belt, armed it, and hurled it behind him at the cavern ceiling. He dove for cover as a deafening boom shook the chamber, the tunnel collapsing in a cascade of rock and dust. Coughing, he staggered to his feet, his ears ringing. The tak-tak war cries echoed through the cavern, muffled now by the wall of rubble. He knew it would only slow them down for a few minutes at best. He had to move. Consulting his wrist display, he scanned the map of the cave system, searching for an alternate route. There, a smaller tunnel branched off from the main passage, snaking deeper into the hillside. It was a gamble, but it might let him circle back and ambush the tak-tak from behind. Rounding a bend, he skidded to a halt, his jaw dropping at the sight before him. The tunnel opened up into a massive underground chamber, easily several kilometers across. Bioluminescent veins pulsed in the walls, casting an eerie blue glow over everything. But it was the structure in the center of the cavern that made his blood run cold. It towered over him, a nightmarish fusion of organic and mechanical components, like some arcane temple crossed with an alien supercomputer. Countless tubes and cables snaked out from it, disappearing into fissures in the rock. The most horrifying part was the scaffold-like frame surrounding the central core. It was woven with the bodies of tak-tak, all hardwired into the machine with metal implants. Their eyes stared vacantly, jaws slack. A deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, setting Tyler's teeth on edge. As he stared at the construct in disbelief, the tak-tak corpses twitched in unison, as if puppeted by invisible strings. Their heads swiveled towards him, a chorus of glottal clicking building in their throats. Tyler's scanner shrilled a proximity alert, snapping him out of his horrified trance. The warband had broken through the tunnel collapse. They were closing fast. He swore viciously, his eyes darting around the chamber, searching for an escape route. There, across the cavern, a narrow fissure in the wall. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was his only chance. Tyler glanced back at the nightmare machine one last time, then took off at a dead sprint, weaving between the pulsing cables. Behind him, the first tak-tak berserkers poured into the chamber, their howls echoing off the walls as they gave chase, baying for his blood. Tyler threw himself into the fissure, jagged rock scraping his armor as he squeezed through the gap. The tunnel on the other side was narrow, the walls slick with moisture and dotted with patches of glowing phosphorescent fungus. Behind him, the scrabbling and hissing of the tak-tak grew louder as they clawed at the opening, trying to force their way through. Heart-pounding, Tyler hurried onward, the tunnel floor sloping gradually upward. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on him from all sides. Minutes crawled by as he navigated the claustrophobic passage, every ragged breath echoing off the close walls. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to widen. Tyler stumbled out into a small grotto, momentarily dazzled by the sudden space. Bioluminescent algae clung to the cavern walls, bathing everything in an eerie spectral green glow. In the center of the grotto was a still dark pool, its surface like polished obsidian. As Tyler approached, he noticed strange, iridescent patterns playing across the inky surface, shifting and coiling in hypnotic fractals. A sudden, almost overwhelming urge to touch the liquid washed over him, to immerse himself in its depths. It called to him on some primal level, promising something. Shaking his head to clear the intrusive thoughts, Tyler started to edge around the pool, giving it a wide berth. Suddenly, without warning, a tendril of the black liquid lashed out like a striking cobra. It coiled around his ankle with startling strength. Tyler yelped in surprise, trying to yank his foot free, but the more he struggled, the tighter the inky tendril gripped. To his horror, he felt the liquid starting to crawl up his leg, leaving a trail of burning, itchy welts, even through his suit. Unslinging his rifle, Tyler aimed point-blank at the grasping tendril. He pulled the trigger, the plasma bolt flash vaporizing a portion of the animated fluid. The tendril recoiled as if burned, releasing its hold. Scrambling backward, Tyler put as much distance between himself and the pool as the cramped grotto allowed. His heart jackhammered against his ribs as he risked a glance back at the pool. The liquid was already flowing back into place, the gap left by his shot sealing over like a healing wound. The iridescent patterns on the surface swirled faster, taking on an angry, reddish hue. A deep, subsonic vibration began to thrum through the chamber, setting Tyler's teeth on edge and making his bones ache. Cold sweat trickled down Tyler's spine as the realization sank in. He was in over his head. He needed to get out of here fast. Spinning on his heel, he fled the grotto, plunging into the first tunnel he saw that led upward. Bringing up the map on his wrist display, Tyler tried to orient himself, to pinpoint his location relative to the landing site. If he could just get back to his pod, he could scrub this mission and call for emergency extraction. As he was studying the map, a sound from behind froze the blood in his veins, the skitter of claws on stone and the labored, hissing breath of creatures that should not be. He whipped around, dreading what he would see. A pack of Tak-Tak berserkers were charging up the tunnel, their nightmare faces contorted with feral rage. Their solid black eyes glittered with malice in the sickly light of the phosphorescent fungi. "Fuck me," Tyler breathed, a numb sense of inevitability settling over him. He was really starting to hate this planet. Raising his rifle, he began spraying plasma bolts wildly behind him as he ran, the superheated projectiles sizzling through the dank air. Several shots found their mark, sending Tak-Tak crashing to the tunnel floor. But more kept coming, heedless of their fallen comrades, driven by an implacable alien bloodlust. Tyler fixed his eyes forward, pouring every ounce of his energy into pumping his legs. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, taunting him. His abused muscles screamed with every stride, his injured leg threatening to buckle. It was going to be a long, desperate slog back to the lander, and with every step, Tyler couldn't shake the gut-wrenching certainty that he might not make it at all. Tyler's pulse pounded in his ears as he burst from the tunnel mouth, the dank air of Xantha's swamps filling his lungs. The baying of the Tak-Tak echoed through the twisted trees, far too close for comfort. He risked a glance at his wrist display, the glowing map of his landing site still a disheartening distance away. Gritting his teeth, he slogged into the muck, each squelching step a Herculean effort. The storm had passed, but an eerie green cast now tinted the sky, like the belly of a sick beast. It bathed the landscape in a pallid, unnatural hue. As he fought through a particularly dense tangle of undergrowth, Tyler's foot plunged into a hidden sinkhole. He yelped, scrabbling at the soggy earth, barely catching himself from being swallowed whole. But his rifle slipped from his fingers, vanishing into the murky depths with a mocking plop. "Fuck me sideways," he growled, hauling himself back to solid ground. His heart hammered against his ribs as he drew his sidearm, the compact plasma pistol feeling woefully inadequate. The charge display winked at him mockingly, barely a dozen shots left. He'd have to make everyone a kill shot. Without warning, the foliage exploded around him, disgorging a dozen frothing, howling Tak-Tak berserkers. Twisting, Tyler snap-fired, the plasma bolts burning fist-sized holes through the lead attacker's torso. It crumpled, but the rest surged forward, heedless, trampling their fallen comrade. Suddenly, a sinuous tentacle lashed from the undergrowth, coiling around the nearest Tak-Tak. It jerked the shrieking creature off its feet, dragging it into the bushes. Tyler froze, as did the remaining Tak-Tak, all eyes locked on the thrashing foliage. A wet crunch, the snapping of bones, then silence. The Tak-Tak chittered nervously, black eyes darting. Seizing the momentary distraction, Tyler slipped away, creeping into the underbrush with as much stealth as his battered body could muster. 50 meters. 100. Then a shrill cry pierced the air. They'd spotted him. Heart in his throat, Tyler ran, weaving between the luminous trees. He chanced to look back. The Tak-Tak bounded after him, powerful legs eating up the distance, but something else was moving in the undergrowth behind them, something massive and serpentine. Tyler faced forward and pumped his legs faster. He vaulted a fallen log, nearly face-planting into a bioluminescent mangrove. Fingers scrabbling at the rugose bark, he hauled himself up, splinters tearing at his palms. Below, the tak-tak skidded to a halt, hissing and gibbering. They paced around the tree's base, eyes glinting with malice. Suddenly, a segmented tentacle thicker than Tyler's torso whipped from the forest, coiling around the tree trunk. It tightened with horrific strength, the bark groaning and splintering under the pressure. Eyes wide with horror, Tyler looked up. A gargantuan centipede-like monstrosity loomed over the tree, slime glistening on its chitinous plates. Its head was a nightmare fusion of mantis and lamprey, compound eyes glittering above a circular, jawless mouth ringed with hooked fangs. More tentacles snaked from the creature's sides, snatching up the tak-tak and stuffing them into that awful maw, their screams cut off abruptly with the wet crunch of chitin. Tyler clung frozen to the tree, terror turning his muscles to stone. The monster's tentacles inched inexorably up the trunk, the wood cracking and splitting under the pressure. In seconds, they'd reach him. The wood splintered and cracked, jagged shards slicing Tyler's skin as the monstrous tentacles crushed the tree. He groped wildly for an escape. There, a thick vine just within reach. Tyler hurled himself at it, hands slamming into the fibrous cord as the trunk exploded beneath him. Splinters peppered his face. The monster shrieked, its tentacles grasping only air. No time to think. Tyler clambered up the vine, biceps burning, bark peeling his palms. Below, the tentacles whipped and cracked, hungry for flesh. Their passage ruffled his hair. His sweat-slicked hands slipped. He plummeted, stomach in his throat. Desperately, he scissored his legs around the vine. Somehow, it worked. He dangled upside down, the creature's jaws snapping shut inches from his nose. Hot, fetid breath washed over him. Heart galloping, Tyler righted himself. He scurried onto the branch and flattened himself against the trunk, trying to melt into the bark. Tentacles probed the leaves around him. The dense foliage seemed to baffle the creature. It huffed in frustration and slithered away, seeking easier quarry. Tyler slumped against the trunk, adrenaline-fueled tremors racking his body. He allowed himself 3 shuddering breaths. No more. He had to reach the lander, but the direct route was suicide, totally exposed. He pulled up the topographical scans on his wrist display, searching for a safer path. There, a winding ravine system, a few clicks east. It could provide cover, maybe all the way to the landing site. Tyler checked his pistol's charge. Enough for a few shots, better than nothing. He sucked in a lungful of humid, fetid air, then started climbing down, scanning the undergrowth for threats. Boots squelching in the muck, he set off at a brisk pace, senses strained to the breaking point. The jungle pressed in, alive with distant alien wails and rustling leaves that could herald an attack at any moment. Every shadow seemed to conceal a predator. Nerves fraying, Tyler forced himself onward, lander coordinates flickering on his display. The ravine couldn't be far now. Tyler's boots skidded on the slick, moss-covered stone as he sprinted along the ledge, his heart jackhammering against his ribs. The pungent stench of the orb creature filled his nostrils, making his stomach churn. He risked another glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The orb was gaining on him, its grotesque bulk surging up the ravine wall with horrifying speed. Its barbed tentacles punched into the rock like pitons, finding purchase in even the tiniest cracks. Tyler could see the orb's surface pulsing and undulating, a hideous parody of a beating heart. He turned back, redoubling his efforts, but the ledge was narrowing with each step. Jagged stones scraped at his armor, tearing through the polymer weave. Ahead, the path twisted sharply, disappearing around a jutting spur of rock. Tyler's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his leg muscles screaming in protest. Behind him, he could hear the orb slamming against the ravine walls, its tentacles scrabbling for purchase. The sound was getting closer with each passing second. Just as he reached the bend, a barbed tentacle whipped past his head, missing him by inches. Tyler yelped, flinching away from the glistening appendage. His foot slipped on the slick stone, sending him stumbling. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Gasping, he scrambled back to his feet, but the orb was nearly on top of him now. Its shadow fell over him like a shroud, blocking out the sickly green light filtering down from above. Tyler looked up, his eyes widening in horror. The orb loomed above him, its membranous surface pulsing with vile hunger. Tentacles lashed the air around him, their barbs dripping with viscous, amber fluid. He scrabbled backward, his hands searching desperately for something, anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a fist-sized chunk of rock, the edges jagged and sharp. As the nearest tentacle darted towards him, Tyler swung the rock with all his strength. It connected with a sickening crunch, the barb shattering like glass. Ichor sprayed from the wound, hissing and steaming where it struck the stone. The orb recoiled, a shudder running through its entire mass. Its remaining tentacles writhed in agony, thrashing against the ravine walls. Tyler seized his chance. He surged to his feet, leaping over the flailing tentacles. His boots pounded against the stone as he ran, the orb's enraged shriek echoing behind him. The ledge curved sharply to the left, the path ahead hidden from view. Tyler didn't slow, rounding the bend at a full sprint. His momentum carried him forward, out over a yawning chasm that opened up without warning. His stomach lurched into his throat as he realized his mistake. He windmilled his arms, trying desperately to alter his trajectory. But it was too late. He was falling, the far side of the ravine rushing up to meet him. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Tyler's boot skidded on the slick stone, nearly sending him tumbling into the yawning chasm below. He caught himself at the last second, heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, the orb creature's tentacles lashed the air, the barbed tips screeching against the rock. He scanned the ravine walls frantically, searching for any escape. There, a narrow crevice barely wider than his shoulders. Tyler hurled himself towards it, squeezing into the gap just as the orb slammed into the rock face behind him. The creature's tentacles probed the crevice, barbs scraping inches from Tyler's face. He wedged himself deeper, the rough stone tearing at his suit. He held his breath, not daring to move. After an eternity, the tentacles withdrew. Tyler heard the orb rolling along the ravine, searching for another way in. He let out a shaky breath, but he knew he couldn't stay put. The thing would find him eventually. Slowly, carefully, he inched deeper into the crevice, feeling his way in the darkness. The rock was slimy under his fingers, and he had to fight for every step on the uneven footing. Time lost all meaning in that black, claustrophobic space. Finally, after crawling for what felt like miles, Tyler saw a faint glimmer ahead, a way out. He quickened his pace, ignoring the burning of his muscles, but as he drew closer, a new sound reached his ears, a low, insectoid chittering that turned his blood to ice. He edged forward and peered around a bend. Dim green light filtered into a small chamber ahead, and crouched in the center, hunched over a small, squirming shape, was a tak-tak berserker. The creature's exoskeleton was cracked, oozing viscous ichor. In its claws it held a hatchling, its mottled grey flesh quivering as the tak-tak tore into it. The hatchling's shrieks echoed off the chamber walls, nearly drowned out by the tak-tak's frenzied chitters. Revulsion rose in Tyler's gorge. He started to back away, desperate not to alert the tak-tak. But his boot slipped on a patch of slime. He fell hard against the crevice wall. The tak-tak's head snapped toward him, compound eyes glinting. It shrieked in rage and lunged, abandoning its grisly meal. Tyler scrabbled backwards, fumbling for his pistol. Too slow. The tak-tak slammed into him, throwing him to the ground. Claws raked his chest, drawing lines of searing agony. Desperately, Tyler jammed his gun under the creature's chin and fired, again and again, until the chamber clicked empty. The tak-tak spasmed and went limp, slumping across him in a tangle of limbs. Tyler lay there gasping, then heaved the corpse off and staggered upright, clutching his bleeding chest. A horrified realization struck him. The orb creature's sounds had gone silent. Had it found another victim, or another way in? Tyler looked around wildly, trying to get his bearings. But before he could move, a nightmare form burst from the shadows. The orb creature surged towards him, tentacles outstretched. He had just enough time to scream before the barbs punched into his flesh, and the world went black. Tyler awoke with a start, his eyes flying open in the murky green gloom. A thick, viscous fluid surrounded him, pressing in on him from all sides. He tried to thrash, to swim, but his limbs wouldn't respond. Panic surged through him as the realization hit. He was paralyzed, suspended in some kind of gelatinous prison, and he couldn't breathe. Tyler's chest burned, his lungs screaming for air. But no matter how he strained, he couldn't draw a breath. The fluid was in his mouth, his nose seeping down his throat. His vision started to tunnel, darkness encroaching at the edges. As the world dimmed, Tyler became aware of shapes drifting in the gloom around him. At first he thought they were just floaters, phantoms conjured by his oxygen-starved brain. But as his eyes adjusted to the strange twilight, the shapes resolved into something horrifyingly familiar. Bodies, human and alien alike, in various states of digestion. Some were little more than skeletons, clad in tatters of envirosuit or chitinous exoskeleton. Others were more fresh. Tyler recognized a tak-tak warrior, its armor pitted and scarred. The small lizard creature from the ravine, its scales already sloughing off as it dissolved. And other forms, too far gone to identify, little more than slurry held together by strands of undigested sinew. With dawning horror, Tyler realized where he was, inside the orb creature, immobilized by some paralytic enzyme being slowly digested alive. He tried to scream, but only tasted bitter slime. His lungs were on fire now, darkness hazing his vision. Dimly, he was aware of movement in the fluid around him. Tendrils of pale, ropey flesh snaked out from the orb's inner walls, probing his body with obscene intimacy. They secreted more of the thick mucus as they explored him, the paralyzing slime seeping through his envirosuit like acid. Then the pain hit, as the orb's digestive enzymes began their grisly work. It started as a tingling itch, but quickly built to a searing agony that consumed Tyler's entire world. He felt like he was being flayed alive, the creature's gastric juices stripping his skin, his flesh, his very being away layer by excruciating layer. He wanted to howl, to thrash, to fight, but the paralytic held him fast, a prisoner in his own dissolving body. The only sound was the pounding of his heart, growing fainter by the second as the fluid filled his lungs. As the edges of Tyler's consciousness frayed, surrendering to the encroaching blackness, he felt a sudden jolt in his midsection. At first he thought it was just another spasm of agony, his guts finally liquefying under the onslaught of the creature's enzymes. But this was different, a tugging sensation deep in his core like a fishhook caught behind his navel. The sensation grew more intense, and Tyler felt a lurching sense of displacement. The orb's innards distorted around him, its membranous walls stretching and deforming as he was pulled inexorably, impossibly, towards some unseen singularity. The fleshy tendrils binding him snapped one by one, recoiling like severed cables. With a wet, tearing sound, Tyler came free of the orb's guts, the paralytic film still clinging to him as he hurtled across dimensions. His body snapped back to its original shape, bones popping and muscles screaming as they remembered their proper alignment. The world twisted, warped, folded in on itself. Tyler's mind reeled, unable to process the non-Euclidean geometries assaulting his senses. And then, with a jarring impact that rattled his teeth, he slammed into a hard metal surface. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.